On an exciting morning in April 2014, a large group of school children in South Korea boarded a ferry, their backpacks stuffed with snacks, cameras, and dreams of an unforgettable school trip to Jeju Island. It was supposed to be a fun trip, a chance to escape the stress of classes and exams. Laughter filled the air as they snapped photos, waved goodbye to their parents, and leaned against the railings, gazing at the endless sea. But no one knew that in just a few hours, their world would turn upside down, literally. Just hours into the journey, something went terribly wrong. The ferry began to tilt. At first, no one panicked. It was just a slight lean, nothing too concerning. But within moments, the ship lurched violently to one side, sending passengers tumbling. Water gushed into the lower decks, and panic set in. Yet, the passengers were told to stay put. What unfolded next was one of South Korea's deadliest maritime disasters. This is the story of the Sewol ferry disaster, a catastrophe that exposed the dark realities behind a system that prioritized profit over lives. Before we start, please take a second to click on that subscribe button, as it's the best way to support this channel. On April 16, 2014, the MV Sewol, a 6,800-ton passenger ferry, was preparing for its routine voyage from Incheon to Jeju Island in South Korea. On board were 476 people, including 325 high school students from Danwon High School. The MV Sewol had a dark history, a past that the passengers knew nothing about. Originally built in Japan in 1994, the ferry was purchased by a South Korean company, Chong Haejin Marine, which made illegal modifications to increase its cargo capacity. These changes weakened the ship's stability, making it extremely dangerous. On the day of the disaster, the ferry was overloaded with cargo, carrying more than twice the legal limit. Worse, the cargo was not properly secured, which meant that any sudden movement could cause the ship to lose balance. And then, at 8:48 a.m., that's exactly what happened. As the ferry approached the notoriously strong currents near Jindo, the third mate, an inexperienced officer who had never navigated this area before, made a critical mistake. Instead of a gradual turn, the ship abruptly changed direction, a sharp, unnatural movement. Inside the cargo hold, tons of freight suddenly shifted, throwing the ferry off balance. The ship lurched violently to the left, tipping at a dangerous 20-degree angle. Passengers felt the sudden tilt and grabbed onto walls, seats, and each other for stability. The students screamed as furniture, luggage, and even people slid uncontrollably. In the lower decks, seawater was already flooding in. Crew members panicked, but they did not send out an immediate distress signal, and then the ferry tilted further, this time past 45 degrees. But instead of ordering an evacuation, the crew told everyone to stay put. By 9:30 a.m., panic spread. The ferry was now almost completely sideways, and yet no evacuation order was given. Then, the captain of the vessel, Lee Jun-sok, did the unthinkable. He escaped the ship first, along with several crew members, abandoning the passengers. By 10 a.m., the ferry was almost completely submerged. Inside, students held onto ceilings and windows as icy seawater rose higher and higher. Some tried breaking windows to escape, but it was impossible. Others made one last phone call to their families. By the time the first Coast Guard boats arrived, only the top portion of the ship was visible above the water. The students trapped inside desperately called for help, but no large-scale rescue operation was launched. Instead, the Coast Guard hesitated, and then, by 11:18 a.m., the ferry disappeared beneath the waves. Survivors who managed to escape on their own were pulled from the freezing water. When the disaster finally ended, 304 people had died, including 250 high school students trapped inside, waiting for orders that never came. Survivors were left in shock, asking the same question over and over again: why didn't they evacuate us? The whole of South Korea was in shock. The entire nation watched live broadcasts of the ferry sinking, unable to believe what was happening. The outrage exploded when it was revealed that government officials had failed to act quickly, that rescuers had stood by while children drowned. As investigations unfolded in the next few weeks, the truth was even more horrifying than imagined. The ferry was illegal, as the company had cut corners for profit. The crew was untrained and inexperienced. The government failed in its rescue response. And worst of all, while hundreds of students were still trapped, the captain and his crew abandoned the ship, leaving children to drown alone in the dark. Security footage later showed the captain climbing into a lifeboat, fully dressed, while many of the students he left behind were struggling to put on life jackets. When the ferry sent out its first distress call, Captain Lee was nowhere near the bridge. He had left the ship in the hands of a third mate, a young, inexperienced officer who had never navigated these waters before. And when the ship began sinking, he never gave an evacuation order. Instead, he abandoned ship first, violating the most sacred rule of the sea. The crew members, who should have helped evacuate passengers, also escaped, leaving behind the very people they were responsible for. Later, survivors testified that no one from the crew came to help. No one had even tried to open the locked doors where students were trapped. But the betrayal didn't end with the captain and crew. The South Korean Coast Guard, the very people responsible for rescuing victims, failed to act quickly. They hesitated. They waited instead of rushing in. When the first rescue boats arrived, the ferry was still floating and people were alive inside. But instead of trying to get in and save them, rescuers only helped the few who had already made it out. The government's response was so slow, so chaotic, that by the time they started serious rescue efforts, the ship was already underwater. As South Korea demanded answers, another mystery emerged. Where was President Park Geun-hye? For 7 hours on the day of the disaster, the president was completely unreachable. No one knew where she was. No one saw her giving orders. By the time she finally made a public statement, the ferry had already sunk. When grieving parents demanded a meeting with her, she refused to see them. Rumors started swirling. Was she asleep? Was she in a beauty treatment? Or was she just ignoring the crisis? Her lack of action became a national scandal, and in 2017, it led to her impeachment. As investigations continued, another dark truth was revealed. The Sewol ferry should have never been in operation. Its operator, Chong Haejin Marine, had made illegal modifications to make room for more passengers and cargo. But these changes made the ship unstable. The cargo was over the legal weight limit, the cargo wasn't properly secured, and the crew was undertrained and unqualified. In the end, the company chose money over lives, and 304 people paid the price. As South Korea grieved, the government began arresting those responsible. Captain Lee Jun-sok was sentenced to life in prison for murder. Several crew members were sentenced to 10 to 30 years for criminal negligence. The CEO of Chong Haejin Marine was arrested, and multiple government officials were fired. For years, parents of the victims fought for justice. They held protests, demanded investigations, and refused to let their children's deaths be forgotten. In 2017, after 3 years underwater, the South Korean government finally raised the Sewol ferry from the ocean floor. Families watched in tears as the rusted wreckage was brought to shore, hoping to recover the remains of their loved ones. Some parents held their children's school uniforms, still neatly folded, never to be worn again. Even years later, South Korea still mourns this tragedy. Every April 16th, the victims' names are read aloud. Yellow ribbons, symbols of remembrance, cover the streets. At the victims' school, the classrooms remain untouched, chairs left empty, textbooks still on desks. One father visits his son's locker every year, where his school uniform remains folded. The Sewol disaster changed South Korea forever. New maritime safety laws were introduced, and the government was forced to improve emergency response systems. But for the families of the victims, the pain never fades. This disaster wasn't just a tragedy. It was a betrayal, a failure. A disaster caused by human greed, cowardice, and incompetence. 304 people died, not because of bad weather, not because of fate, but because the very people who should have protected them abandoned them instead. The disaster exposed the failure of a system that prioritized money and power over human lives.